to go. So welcome everyone to week 4 of our Theology on Tap that is being hosted by St. Clement Chicago, St. Vincent de Paul Chicago, and Holy Name Cathedral, part of the Archdiocese of Chicago's Theology on Tap 2020 series. Tonight we are blessed to welcome Sister Anita Baird, and we'll tell you a little bit more about her in a minute. Our topic is the past, present, and future of anti-racism work in the church. And to get us started, I am going to go to Caroline Cronin, who is going to lead us in our opening prayer.
Thanks, Michael. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Dear God, in our efforts to dismantle racism, we understand that we struggle not merely against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities, those institutions and systems that keep racism alive by perpetuating the lie that some members of the family are inferior and others superior. Create in us a new mind and heart that will enable us to see brothers and sisters in the faces of those divided by racial categories. Give us the grace and strength to rid ourselves of racial stereotypes that oppress some while providing entitlement to others. Help us to create a church and a nation that embraces the hopes and fears of oppressed people of color where we live, as well as those around the world. Heal your family, God, and make us one with you, in union with our brother Jesus, and empowered by your Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. So our speaker this evening is Sister Anita Baird, and she is a native of Chicago, a member of the religious congregation of the Society of the Daughters of the Heart of Mary, and she's been a regional superior, provincial counselor, and most recently the United States Provincial. She's a member of St. Sabina Catholic Church on the south side of Chicago, where she has served in many different leadership roles, including chair of the Spiritual Life Institute and a member of the preaching staff. In 1997, Sister Anita became the first African American to serve as Chief of Staff to the Archbishop of Chicago, and in 2000, Cardinal Francis George appointed her the founding director of the Archdiocese of Chicago's Office for Racial Justice, which directed the Archdiocese initiatives to eradicate racism in its structures and institutions. Sister Anita also served as Cardinal George's liaison for race relations to the city of Chicago. She has been recognized by her religious and community activism around the nation. She's a past president of the National Black Sisters Conference and recipient of the organization's Harriet Tubman Moses of Her People Award. Her other honors include the NBC-5 Jefferson Award for outstanding community service and the Fresh Spirit Award in recognition of her outstanding spiritual and community leadership in the city of Chicago. She has a bachelor's in sociology from DePaul University, a master's in theological studies from Loyola University Chicago, and an honorary doctorate of ministry from the Catholic Theological Union. All of that is to say, Sister Anita has been putting in the work of racial justice for a very long time, and we're very grateful to welcome her tonight. Sister Anita, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Michael. That is to say how old I am. You made me feel very old when you got through with that.
So Sister Anita, so you were born right here in the city of Chicago, and last week our presenter, Matthew Kressler—
Been around a long time.
Yes. So you were born here in Chicago, and last week our presenter, Matthew Kressler, talked about the Great Migration and how many African Americans came to Chicago. Tell us a little bit more about your own family history and your experience growing up here in Chicago.
Well, I really wasn't born here. I have to acknowledge that. I was born in Missouri, but my mother went there to be with her sister when I was born. And so I came back to Chicago when I was 6 weeks old. So this is certainly home, and I've lived here all of my life. It's interesting, even how I became Catholic, because when I was born, my family was Lutheran. And when it was time for me to start school, there was not a Lutheran school that would take a Black child. And this was a child, your church isn't good enough for me. And so we stopped being Lutheran that day, and she marched me up the street a block away and enrolled me in St. Anselm's Catholic School. And so my whole family converted and we became Catholic. So really, I think the whole journey kind of begins with how we have been segregated as a city and the racism that we find prevalent. We certainly found prevalent in the church then, and unfortunately we continue to find it prevalent today. When I was ready to go into third grade, my mother sent me to St. Louis to live with her sister because she wanted me to go to integrated schools, and none of the Catholic schools here were integrated at that time. And so one of my heroes is Cardinal Ritter, who integrated the Catholic schools in St. Louis in 1947. And he was very clear when people rebelled, he said, you know, they could either accept it or be excommunicated. It was one or the other. So he stood very firm on that. And so I went there for 2 years, and that from third grade to fourth grade. And that was my first experience of going to an integrated school. I returned here in time for fifth grade. My parents bought a home. And so it was in the midst of African Americans' mobility and becoming more solidly middle class and able to buy homes and move into better neighborhoods and less congested neighborhoods. And so my family moved into Chatham around 83rd and King Drive. So that's where I spent my growing up years from the time I was 10, and stayed in that community for about 40 years. So I experienced even then going to a Catholic school in White Flight. And it's very true. You went to bed and your neighbors were white, and you woke up in the morning and your neighbors were black. So people kind of moved out in the middle of the night. I never experienced overt racism or hostility as a child, but I certainly saw some of it around me. And I saw how neighborhoods change and what that means in terms of even how the church responds. And whether you are welcomed or not, we saw pastors here in Chicago that very clearly would stand in the church door. They would stand ushers in the church door. And they let their people know right away that they were not for integration, that these people moving in were threatening their way of life. And so Chicago has the reputation of being the most segregated city in the country. And that was set up deliberately. So when you said you had a speaker on talking about the Great Migration, I certainly understand, you know, that story and how it has impacted and continues to impact up to this day.
Thank you. So you're a member of a religious community. Can you tell us a little bit more about your religious community, how you met them, and how you became part of this order?
Well, it's kind of a long story. Let me try to shorten it for you. Right out of high school, I entered the sisters that taught me at St. Anselm's, the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, founded by St. Catherine Drexel. And I like to say that I was invited to leave. And I was told that they didn't think I had a vocation. I was sent home. And I was crushed by that because I really believed I did have a vocation. But I came home, I went to work, I continued school. And so that was in the mid 60s. But I never lost the desire for religious life. And so around, probably around 1979, I was working for the telephone company in marketing, and we were moving. And I was going, let me back up. I was going to a customer's, and I was looking the customer up in a phone book. A lot of folks don't know what a phone book is today, but we had the big phone books, and that's how we found people. And I found, as I'm looking for the customer, the name Daughters of the Heart of Mary. I knew a little something about every major religious congregation. I could pretty much tell you who founded them, a little bit about their charism. Had never heard of this group. So that piqued my interest. I wrote the name down, put it in my desk, but I never acted on it. And a couple of years later, we were moving and I'm cleaning out and I find this name. And all I can say is it had to be the Holy Spirit that said call, because I don't know why I called. I'm an only child. My father had died, and I knew that God wasn't asking me to leave my mother again. I didn't think I could do that. So why I called, I don't know, but I did. And I got a wonderful woman on the phone, Marguerite McGuire. And she says, well, I'll send you a brochure. And she did. And in it said that you can enter religious life, remain at home if you have family obligations, and do your formation on the weekends at the community house. And I'm thinking, this is too good to be true. Why had I not heard of this? And I called her back and I said, maybe I'm not getting this. I'm not understanding this. And so she says, no, dear. So she told me we were founded in 1790 during the height of the French Revolution to preserve religious life because they were killing religious. And so we never wore a habit, and our sisters were not known as religious. And during the revolution, we would move in as religious were put out and take over the schools and try to return them back, whatever we had tried to maintain for them. So we have always read the signs of the times. We've never had a particular apostolate. And because of our ability of being known or unknown, we could live consecrated life in the midst of the world. And so we have sisters with very interesting stories that have been, and this was going way back, being attorneys working in the business world. And many of them, like myself, had family responsibilities. So it was an answer to a prayer. And so I entered in 1981. So that's how I came to enter my congregation.
I'm just encouraging our young adults to think about wanting to be a religious sister so badly that even after one order said no, continuing to look for a home, the Holy Spirit clearly at work there.
I say, Michael, that once God extends an invitation, God never takes it back. And you may go a lot of different ways, but he continues to call and continues to tug at your heart. And I have never regretted my yes. Every day I wake up in gratitude for the gift of my vocation. Not that it's a better vocation than any other, but it's the.
So how specifically did you get involved in the work for racial justice?
Well, I guess when I look back at least in my early 20s, I became very involved with Operation Breadbasket, Operation Push, founded by Reverend Jesse Jackson, and became learning much more about racism and racial justice. I have to admit, I grew up quite sheltered. I was never exposed to the ugly side of life. I think my parents worked very hard to keep me from experiencing that. But I had a friend that started going to the meetings and invited me, and I realized I knew so little. And so I was, hungering to learn more. And it was at the beginning of, say it, loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. And the different movements that were happening and the struggles led by Dr. King and all this. So I was just exposed to all of that and became involved. From there, as I joined St. Sabina's, they've always been very proactive in racial justice, as they are now around the violence in the communities and the killings in the communities. And it was before the end of apartheid in South Africa. And we always, once a year, we would march at the South African embassy here in downtown Chicago. So that was kind of the beginning of it for me. I was not looking, though, to do this work. After I retired from the phone company, I went to work for the Archdiocese in the Office for Catechesis. And while I was there, Cardinal Bernardin passed, and it was interim between Cardinal George coming, and the Archdiocese was being run at that time by Bishop Geddard, Raymond Geddard. And there was a situation here, I don't know how many people heard about it, but it was the savage beating of a young man named Leonard Clark. And it was in the Bridgeport community of Chicago. And as horrific as this was, what made it even worse was that the 3 young men were graduates of a Catholic high school. And so that was just a stunning moment. And Bishop Geddard pulled a committee together, and it was made up, and then representatives from the Black Catholic community and others. And he asked, what can we do? Evidently, we failed as a church, and we need to address this. And so out of that, there were 3 key things. And one was that when we did have a new archbishop, that he would write a pastoral letter on racism. And the second was that there would be an office that would be dedicated to working on these issues. And the third, that there would be some type of significant training within the Archdiocese, particularly in the schools. And so that was around, then he was looking for an executive assistant to run his office. And I have to say that Father Mike Flavor called me one day at work, and he says, I'm going to submit some names of some Black Catholics for this position. He says, because they always say they can't find Black people. So I'm going to make sure they know where to find some. And he said, I want to submit your name. And I said, oh, I said, Mike, that's a waste of time. I said, I don't think so. And, but he insisted, he did. And I was called in and interviewed and went through the process. And then Cardinal George, I met with him, and he hired me. So for 3 years, I was responsible for the running of his office. During this time, he was looking at all of the recommendations, and he really wanted to move forward on an office. And he asked me, would I be willing to be the founding director? And I said no. I loved what I was doing. And I knew that was going to be a headache in the Archdiocese of Chicago. And I didn't necessarily want to have to deal with that headache. And so I put him off, and he kept coming back and coming back. And finally he said, Sister Anita, I need you to do this. He said, I trust you, and you'll tell me not just what I want to hear, but what I need to hear. And so I reluctantly said yes. And I didn't know where that was going to go. So that was how I came to, begin the office. And when I look back on it, it was a difficult time. It was as difficult as I thought it would be. But I also feel that we were able to accomplish some good things. Not that we solved everything, by no means, but at least the awareness to address issues as they arose, and to know that the Archdiocese of Chicago was standing on the right side of history. So that's how I came to be director of the office.
So thank you. So Cardinal George writes a pastoral letter in 2001, in part in response to this beating of Leonard Clark, but obviously racial justice issues go much larger. So many of my generation, I think, would be surprised to hear that Cardinal George in 2001 is using the word anti-racism, a word that is becoming very popular now with Ibram Kendi and some of the other anti-racism trainers. Cardinal George actually works into his pastoral letter in 2001, and out of that, he commissions the Archdiocese to be doing these anti-racism trainings and workshops. What kind of stuff were you all doing in the early 2000s?
Well, what the Cardinal decided was that he was not going to wait to go through anti-racism training and to make this a priority in the Archdiocese. So he made it a mandate. He made it a mandate that all of the leaders in the schools, teachers, principals, would go through the training, that pastoral leadership in the parishes would go through the training. Now, the interesting thing is the schools really did embrace it. And they kind of had stepped out even before the office was started. There were several principals in the Archdiocese that had gone through anti-racism training and were committed to this. So they had taken the lead even before we had an office, which was good. So they were in a place where they were ready to move forward. The parishes were not there, so we had to kind of bring them along. And we received a lot of resistance from many parishes in the Archdiocese. I had pastors to say to me, we don't have any of those people, therefore we don't have any problems. You know, so it was difficult in many ways in working with the parishes. But no, the Cardinal was very clear around even anti-racism. People weren't quite, it's like Black Lives Matter today. People aren't really sure if they want to say it. And what does it mean? Does it mean that only Black lives matter? You know, everyone has for why they're uncomfortable the recent month in embrace of the term. Well, the same thing was true here when we started talking about anti-racism. You know, what does that mean? You know, what are you calling us? You know, are you saying we're racist? You know, and so people had concerns about that. So we, you know, we had to have a foundation, and his pastoral letter became that foundation. I think not simply because I was involved in it, but we had excellent consultants. And I think it's one of the better letters around racism that was written by any of the bishops in the country.
Yeah, so in that letter, he distinguishes between individual racism, which is what I think a lot of people think of when they think of racism. They think of an individual who has prejudiced thoughts or actions, or perhaps goes to a white nationalist rally. But he distinguishes between individual racism and systemic racism through institutions, and even spatial racism. And he talks about spatial racism affecting housing and neighborhoods and healthcare and communities. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that spatial racism looks like in the city of Chicago?
Well, I think it fits so well when we try to define the history of the city of Chicago, because it's always been spatially segregated in the city, and it was done deliberatively. When you look at public housing that went up along the Dan Ryan from 22nd Street out to 55th Street, and people piled on top of each other because Mayor Daley refused to have public housing integrated in all of the communities. He was not willing to do that for several reasons. One was the vote, and keeping the Black vote where he wanted it and being assured of it was one thing. And he knew that many of the white communities would not be welcoming of having Black people moving in. And then you had the parishes that very much supported that as well. So the Cardinal understood the lack of housing, poor education, the lack of jobs, healthcare, the environment, water, air, how all of that impacts poor communities and communities of color. And the best example of that has been Flint, Michigan, and the water crisis there. And so he felt that, we can talk about individual racism or prejudice, but you don't have to like me. If you don't like me, that's fine. But you don't have a right to impact my ability to live fully as a human being and as an citizen. But when in every fight, then, when you talk about not being able to breathe, that's what happens. People of color in communities that struggle each and every day, they really can't breathe. And they are being killed very slowly, but deliberatively every day.
Yeah, still a lot of work to do around anti-racism, not just in parishes and individual hearts, but in our systems and policies and institutions. So we've talked a lot about kind of the past. Our title tonight is the past, present, and future of anti-racism. We've talked a lot about the past, and thank you for sharing with us some of that history. When you look around at the present, what do you see happening presently that you think is worth highlighting?
Well, let me say this. Right now, at this moment, I am hopeful. And I think what I see for so long, even when we began our work at the Archdiocese, there was a sense that somehow Black people were responsible for helping white people to understand why they were racist. You know, the burden was ours. Well, it's not my burden, because racism is not my problem. Am I impacted by it? Yes. But racism has to be owned, white America. And a commitment has to be there for white America to take the leadership role in addressing systemic racism. And so I think it's important for us, when I'm looking at the movement now, and I look at even the marches in the streets, there are so many people that are participating and owning it besides Black people. That gives me hope. I have hope in the younger generations, because let's face it, my generation has failed miserably. And I was doing a workshop with some sisters a few months ago, and they said, well, how will this, really change? Will it ever change? And I said, I hope when we die out that it will. And they were like, oh my God, what are you saying? We have to die. But I said, well, you know what? At some point we have to move aside. And we have to let the younger generations that look at this differently, that understand what a world house looks like because of technology. And so we live in the same neighborhood, whether we're here in the United States or we're way across the ocean somewhere. So there's a sense of oneness that my generation did not necessarily have. So I'm hopeful in that. I'm hopeful that more people are owning this and saying this is not right and it has to change. When you look at the consistent marches that are taking place, you look at how many of the structures are being challenged today in ways that they've not been challenged before. So I try to remain hopeful and optimistic. I can't say I'm always successful at that, but I see this as a moment that if we really embrace it, can bring about real substantial change in our institutions. And I would say beginning, for us as Catholics, beginning with our church. And maybe at some point we can really own the sin of racism, because slavery began with the Catholic Church. And we have to own that. And we have to look at how in the 15th century, popes, blessed European countries to go to Africa and enslave people, to come to this country and to take the land from non-believers. And so that was, it was sanctioned. And so when you look at the number of slaves owned by the country, by religious congregations in this country, and yet we fail in the pastoral letters to really own that and to speak to that. But I think at this moment, we are going to be seeing more of that. The consciousness of why do we have statues that honor people who committed treason against this country? Are statues that honor someone like Junipero Serra and what was done to the Native people in California. Young people are asking these questions and demanding change. So that makes me very hopeful.
So we're going to do one more question that we have already, and then we're going to turn it over to Q&A. So if you have a question for Sister Anita, a comment, want to be part of the conversation, what I'd ask is please submit it through the chat box, and we'll line people up so that we can have a discussion around all this. Again, thank you for being here, and we encourage people to submit questions. Final question is, we said past, present, and future, and you touched a little bit on the future, but specific to what you just said around hope in the young generation and parishes, and linking that with Cardinal George's talk about institutional racism, and one of the institutions is the Catholic Church. So my question would be, we've been asking in this series, we Catholics have this sense of it's not enough to confess your sin. There has to be atonement, there has to be penance, justice has to be brought about, and we're trying to get people comfortable with using this word reparations. In your mind, the future of anti-racism work, what would it look like for a Catholic community to begin the work of reparations and restorative justice?
Very good question. I think one of the things that bothers me is the disappearance of the Catholic Church in the Black community. The closing of so many Catholic schools. And the sense that because these people are not Catholic, we don't have a responsibility to education. And yet it was because of the Catholic Church that did not abandon the communities. Yes, there was struggle as communities were changing, but for the most part, the Catholic Church remained, and it provided a better education for particularly children of color. And when you look at a lot of the leadership, not only in Chicago, but throughout the country, Black leadership, at some point, they went to Catholic schools. And so now we have fewer and fewer. So there's an abandonment. When I really think that if the church is serious about, when we talk about reparations, most of the time people think, oh, you're asking for a big check, and you want money. That's part of it because it's owed to us. We never got the 40 acres and the mule. And so when you look at over the years since the end of slavery, what slave labor would be worth today, of the trillions of dollars, when you look at the wealth of this country that was built on the slavery. Yes, there is that financial commitment to in making sure that the church is there where it is most needed and putting those resources there. So my fear is that the Black Catholic community is dying, and that there is not a strong commitment to not only keeping it alive, but to growing it and understanding the responsibility that even if the majority of the children in our schools are not Catholic, that we are living the gospel and serving those most in need. So that, Cardinal George really struggled with closing places for that very reason, and he closed very few. And I know we're in a different moment, but I also realize if we had not had to put out billions of dollars for sexual abuse, how that money could have been used in poorer communities, and we could provide state-of-the-art education in those communities, and we could build them up, and we could support parishes that maybe are smaller, but they need to be there for a witness. So what is our priority as Catholics, and how do we respond? So I think that's, when reparations is much more than money, it's very broad. When we look at resources, jobs, when we look at housing in our communities, and how do we react to that, and how do we help to build viable communities where people can live decently and unafraid, and they can educate their children and provide for them. To me, that's what reparations is about, correcting what we have done wrong for 400 years from A to Z, and understanding that we have given reparations. In fact, at the end of the Civil War, Southern planters were given reparations. They were given money. There was an article, maybe it was on TV, about Lloyds of London and the wealth that they amassed through the slave, business. And so the wealth of this country has been built on the backs of enslaved people. And so that has to be corrected. And there has to be an acknowledgement also. And I think not only from the government, but from the church, from any institution that has benefited from slavery. There has to be that owning it, the acknowledging of it, the asking forgiveness, and then putting the resources there.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm going to go to Elizabeth, who has a question for you.
Sure.
Hi, this is Tom and Elizabeth Grove. We're down in Indiana and really enjoying this series. So what would you recommend for a majority white parish to encourage more discussion about these topics, which is obviously a little uncomfortable? What does that dialogue look like?
That's a very good question. Thank you. I think to begin with, parishes cannot be afraid to have the conversation. And I think a lot of that is owed to the leadership. We've got to stop watering down the gospel. The gospel is meant to make us uncomfortable, to challenge us, to get us on our behinds to do something. And so I think, we need courageous leaders in our parish to raise the issue, to raise it to the pastor. If the pastor is hesitating to have these type of conversations, I would encourage that you find people in your parish that think like you and begin small group sessions and do as much reading of corrected history. Because I like to say that most of us were lied to in school, because the history that we were taught was not the truth. It was painted a certain way to benefit a certain group of people. And so the only way we're going to learn truth is to do the reading for ourselves and to find as many books and documents and that we can to begin to re-educate. So that's something you can do with like-minded people. And to encourage your pastor, if he doesn't preach about this, to do it. And then I think if you have any kind of relationship with any communities, parishes of color, if you don't, see if you can begin to forge that. And it's not, I think the one thing that bothers me is that most predominantly white parishes is doing charity. So you have a soup kitchen, or you collect groceries, or you gather clothing, and you're helping those poor people. Well, in reality, the poverty is on both sides. And so there has to be a shared understanding of one another, respect, mutuality, and to the more you get to know people, you can enter into the conversations where you can hear their stories and you can be challenged and you can be held accountable. So those would be some of the ways that I would, encourage you to do that. Another thing is even looking at the art in your parish. Is everything that you look at white in your parish? Challenging that. I think the one thing I believe, I think we all should be able to see Jesus in our own image. But the reality is Jesus was a Palestinian Jew. Jesus was a man of color. He was not white. So we need to teach that truth and to understand what the whiteness of God has done, particularly here in this country, but around the world in terms of superiority. So those that look the closest to God, are the ones who are closest to God. And so we need to break that down and to begin to have artwork that is diverse in our parishes and that honors. If we're a universal church, even if your parish is white, predominantly, does not mean you cannot reflect the universality of the church. So those are just some of the things that I would suggest to you. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go to Dan, who has a question. Dan, are you able to unmute yourself. Okay, he might not. So he had the question, what popes do you know, sister, what popes it were that sanctioned slavery when you mentioned?
The papal bulls, I don't have the names right in front of me, but it was around the 1450s, 1460s.
Oh, yes, I want to ask more about the. So he had a question.
Hi, Dan, are you there? We can't hear you. All right, sorry about that. Well, just so everyone knows, I don't want to get caught up in that, but the papal bull that is most commonly referred to is Dum Diversas and or Dum Diversas, and it was 1452 from Pope Nicholas Pope Nicholas V, and there's a link in the chat box if you want to learn more about the papal bulls that officially divvied up the new world for European powers. So I want to go now to Daniel Gandert, who has a question. So Daniel, I'm going to go to you.
Yes. So you had mentioned Junipero Serra earlier, and my understanding is that he's a saint in the church. So I was wondering how you recommend reconciling the concerns that you had mentioned with our respect and reverence for the saints in the church teachings on that.
That's a good question. I want to be careful how I say this. I personally believe that there are many people that have been declared saints by our church who are not necessarily saints. And I think we will be surprised when we get to the other side and find that some of them are not there. I think in this case, and he was just, in fact, it was Pope Francis that canonized him. It's complicated in the sense that he certainly loved the church, and in that time probably felt that he was doing what was right. He certainly tried to stand up for the native people, but in building the missions, in many respects, they were treated as slave labor. They were forced to give up their culture and to be westernized. Many of their lands were taken from them. And so it's difficult to honor someone, though we have to also look at the context of history. And so he probably felt he was doing the right thing and to the best of his ability, and sanctioned certainly by the church. So we're looking at it through today's lens. And when you talk about reparations, part of reparations is teaching the truth about history and understanding that there are those who have been declared saints that probably were very racist and had superior attitudes, and which in many ways were sanctioned by the church. And today we have to look at it through the lens of the world today and what we know is right, and try to reconcile that. Is it easy to do? No, it isn't. It's very difficult. And I think we should be very careful how we declare people who are saints. They started the cause for Fulton Sheen, and then they pulled back on that because there were some things that were coming up that they were beginning to feel uncomfortable with. So, you have to look at it in the context of the times, but never to water down the truth of history, and to address it today in light of who we are today and the world that we live in.
Sister Anita, to that point, thank you. I think of my own 13 years of diocesan elementary and high school, and I think of my Catholic college, and I think of the textbooks we had in religious education growing up and how they always showed us, the age of exploration and the courageous, European explorers, and that was the history that we were presented with. We were
That's
presented
right.
and then we were presented with the missionaries holding up the crucifixes to share the gospel, and this whole narrative of colonialism was kind of whitewashed through the lens of
Yeah.
sharing the gospel.
Yeah.
Sharing the gospel.
And when I was growing up, we adopted pagan babies in Africa. Okay, so there was a little bank that sat on sister's desk, and you put your little pennies and nickels and dimes to buy pagan babies. So what does that do, particularly to children of color, in terms of their own self-image and understanding of who they are in the sight of God? So there's so much, that we have to look at and address. And I think we should not be afraid as church to say, okay, he was declared a saint, but we cannot deny that this is what he did and the impact that had on Native communities. And how do we right that wrong? And the Franciscans are struggling with that. That's a question that they're struggling with. And it's just like Georgetown, the Jesuits had to come to terms with having to Georgetown University. And so what they have done is that they are offering scholarships to all of the descendants of those slaves that they sold. That's their way of giving reparations and owning it. So at some point we have to own the sin if we're going to ever atone for it.
My alma mater, Georgetown, yes.
Okay.
So to that point, I actually just put a link in the box for those who are interested. The Jesuits have started something called the Slavery, Memory, History, and Reconciliation Project, which is designed for the society to really go back and explore their own, not just complicity, but active role in enslaving human beings here in the United States. So for anyone who would like to do that education of learning more, and how we deal, Daniel is a fellow Georgetown alum, so I don't mind saying, I asked a friend who's involved in the slavery project at Georgetown, and I said, well, what about John Carroll? Big statue in front of the university, Archbishop John Carroll, first Catholic bishop. And my friend who was involved said his personal thought is that we shouldn't take the statue down because it is part of our history. It should say founding father, Catholic Archbishop, slave owner, or enslaved human beings, and put that right front and center on the plaque. So, and say, well, that's part of the history.
Yeah, that's true.
So I have a question from Dave, who asks, you said that you are hopeful that something might be different this time. What is it that makes you think this could be a different moment?
Well, I think just, we can even look at the demonstrations in the streets that are still continuing around police reform. I think it's a sense that people are not going to give up and forget and go about their daily business, that this is going to remain front and center. I think it's going to be very much a part of this upcoming election. So I think from that, there seems to be a commitment. There seems to be a sense that more white Americans in this country are acknowledging that racism is a major problem in this country. A few years ago, with the election of Barack Obama, everything was perfect. We lived in paradise. There was no racism. We elected our first Black president. What more do you want? But after he was out of office, and we have seen the ugliness and in your face, it's almost like people have permission to be very clear about their hate and how they treat people of color. So I think with the murder of George Floyd, I think several things. In the midst of this pandemic, people were at home, they're looking at their TVs or they're on the internet. They could not help but to see it. And not that there have not been hundreds and thousands of Black men, women, and children that have been lynched in this country. To watch that for those, they said it was even more than 8 minutes and 46 seconds. But you saw the coldness in that officer's eyes as he knelt on that man's neck. I think touched and seared the hearts of most people in this country, even those that perhaps would not want to live next to somebody that was Black, but they could not deny what they were seeing. And so I think this is a pivotal moment. It's like the killing of Emmett Till in 1955, which began the modern day civil rights movement as we know it. When his mother allowed that coffin to be opened so that you could see the brutality and how her son looked, it changed the nation and it moved us to have to address this issue. And I think this is another one of those seminal moments that is causing us to do that.
Well, Sister Anita, thank you so much. We're done with our Q&A. We really appreciate everyone who participated. We're so grateful for you sharing some of your personal history, but also some of the history here in Chicago. I want to invite everyone to consider joining us for some of our fall programs that we're finalizing dates for. We're going to be doing an event with Loyola Chicago's White Coats for Black Lives, an organization that has national chapters now, and they have a chapter at Loyola Chicago as well as University of Chicago, and we're going to be doing it with some doctors from the city, and we're going to be talking about racial justice from the healthcare perspective. What would taking seriously healthcare as a racial justice issue? We're working on events related to mass incarceration, police brutality, and a whole range of issues. So if you have other topics or speakers that you'd like to see us covering as part of this, please let me know. We did include in the comment box the parish anti-racism guide that we put together. So if you're like, okay, I liked this Theology on Tap, I want to do some of the reading Sister Anita and the other speakers were talking about, where do I start? And so we've got things like Ta-Nehisi Coates's, the case for reparations, or We Were 8 Years in Power. We've got recommendations, Father Maurice Nutt's book on Sister Thea Bowman, all sorts of great things that if you want to do this work, the reading, the education. One thing in particular, since Sister Anita is representative of a long tradition that hasn't always been taught in terms of the contributions of Black Catholic religious, I encourage you to think about Diane Batts Morrow's book on the history of Black Catholic sisters in this country, as well as the research of Shannon D. Williams, who is finishing a book, but is also writing a ton of articles on the contributions of Black Catholic sisters that largely have been kind of erased from the history books. So there's lots to keep us going after this series, and we just thank Sister Anita again for tonight, and hope that we can pick up the mantle of the anti-racism work that she and so many others were doing in the Archdiocese and have continued to do, that folks like St. Clement, St. Vincent de Paul, Holy Name, and all the other communities that joined us for this can commit to the long work of anti-racism in our parish and in our country. Thank you, everyone, and we hope that you'll join us for some of our fall events. Thank you, Sister Anita.
Thank you, Michael.